This is Dr. Mariah White, host of Your Life Matters. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
The Leadership Show, the place where leaders learn more about themselves and how they can shift the way they lead. Because when leaders get better, families get better, communities get better, and the world gets better. And now your host, Chief Leadership Officer of Shepherd Revolution, David Prosper.
If you're listening for the first time to the Leadership Show, we want to personally welcome you. We started this podcast because too many of us have been hurt, underappreciated, and abused by unhealthy leaders. And we believe that when leaders get better, families get better, communities get better, our workplace gets better, and ultimately our world gets better. We tend to start our podcast off with a verse of the day, and today's verse is John 15, verse 12. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. This verse is powerful because it's teaching us to love one another the way Jesus loved us. And I remember even in John 3:16 that we talked about in our last episode, that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So he gave us something. And that's what it truly means to love, is to give of ourselves. Again, we can find our verse in John 15, verse 12. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. There are two kinds of leaders in our world: leaders who command and leaders who connect. I believe that transformation happens when we apply, learn information. Our shows are intentionally under 30 minutes for working professionals, busy parents, and on-the-go students, and most importantly, aspiring leaders. I have a question for you today. Have you been affected by domestic violence? Or do you know someone who's in an unhealthy relationship? We are continuing our conversation from our previous episode with Audrey May Prosper. If you answered yes to either one of those questions, then today's episode is just for you. Today, we'll be talking again with Audrey May Prosper, who is the founder of Your Thrive Tribe, an organization that helps women connect, heal, and grow in life and in Christ. My amazing wife, the mother of our kids, and a serial thriver of domestic violence. Today's show is part 2 of looking at domestic violence through the leadership lens. Now, let's recap part 1. On part 1, we talked about what type of leadership styles we grew up in and how it affected us. And we talked about how we now lead our families and how our current culture addresses domestic violence. We also briefly touched on how we can end domestic violence through the vehicle of leadership. On today's show, we're going to dive in a little deeper and discuss how we can end domestic violence through the leadership lens. Let's just dive right in. Audrey, thank you again for being on our show. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's imperative to know where we came from in order to know where we're going. So let's go back for just a second, all right? When we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about when one partner is mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, or even digitally abusing the other in order to gain or maintain power and control. So I think the first question we need to ask, David, is why would somebody want to gain or maintain power and control?
Someone I think about, and I talked about it in one of my first episodes of Dictators, Styles of Leadership, and I think of Adolf Hitler and what he experienced growing up. He experienced a feeling of being powerless, and he never wanted to go back to feeling powerlessness. So what happens? It creates a need for certainty. So I think that's the deeper root of what you talked about, the power and control is when an individual has once felt powerless. So now they're in a position of power and they never, ever want to feel that feeling again of not being in power.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because what you said too was you alluded to how power and control, there was a deeper need of certainty there. So that would mean that power and control is a symptom of that greater need. And I think just often in our culture overall, in the Western society, we tend to diagnose symptoms as if they're the root cause, and we treat symptoms as if they're the root cause, when in actual reality, they're only a symptom. Anxiety, I think, would be a really big one in our culture right now, that it's being diagnosed as the cause, when in fact, it's a symptom of something that's there underneath the surface. So talk to me about that greater need then. Power and control is a symptom of a greater need.
Well, according to Tony Robbins, he talks about the 6 human needs, and then I'll go through them. So one of them are love and connection, certainty, growth, contribution, significance, and variety. And
you went over that real fast, like slow your roll. Help me understand a little bit. Okay, what are those needs? I don't think I've ever even heard of the 6 human needs.
So love and connection, every one of us, we have a desire for love and we have a desire for connection. And sometimes we will essentially substitute the one for the other. So we will, we live in the world, the dating world, right? So sometimes we will get on Tinder or Match.com. So we would prefer connection over love sometimes, but our true desire is love, certainty. We all need certainty in our lives. We don't start our cars and wonder if it's going to start or not, but we have faith because previous times it started, or the chair that we're sitting on, or the relationship that we're in. We're always looking for certainty that this is going to work. Growth is important. We have to feel that we're actually moving forward because I truly believe that progress equals happiness. And then as we take our steps forward, as we're developing, as we're growing, we essentially fulfill that need. So growth is one of them. Contribution. We live in the social media world, right? So when something really cool happens, what is the first thing we do?
Like it.
We like it, and what else?
Comment.
We comment, and what else?
We share.
We are sharing it constantly on social media. So we're contributing to the world, saying, hey, look at what we've accomplished, or what we're accomplishing.
Or what we have to say about it. Or contribution, I think of like volunteering and giving back, and specifically in the faith, contributing through your spiritual gifts.
Spiritual gifts, as well as if you are attending church, you're giving tithe, you're contributing to the well-being of everybody in the congregation. Or if you ever watch one of those commercials where 80 cents a day can feed a child, you're contributing to the world. So that's one way of doing it. And then significance, everybody has a need for it. And social media magnifies that need of, I need to feel important in the eyes of the people around me. So we have a need to be significant in people, in the relationships we have. And then variety. Variety is important. Tony Robbins often talks about it. If we knew what was going to happen every single day, we would be bored out of our minds. Now, surprises are good if it's in your favor. Bad surprises like, hey, I'm pregnant and we're not married, that's not a good surprise. But variety in our lives keeps us. There's a quote that says, variety is the spice of life. It keeps it different. It keeps it flowing. So those 6 human needs are what we essentially need in our lives. And some are more magnified than others, depending if that cup is filled. If that cup is not filled, then we try to look to fill those cups with other things. And sometimes those are not the healthiest behaviors. Yeah,
you said variety and surprises are good, and sometimes they're not good. And so I think about trauma when you say that. Trauma is a shock that was unexpected. That's how trauma is created. And so I definitely know what that's like. Most of us know what that's like. But that need for certainty, I would say, and significance would be a root issue for the need for power and control, the need to feel significant, and the need to have certainty that that person's always going to stay with us. They're not going anywhere, and certain that we will always have power, right? And we'll always be able to control them. That definitely plays out in relationships that are unhealthy and even violent.
Yes, definitely. So how does this, oftentimes I talk about poor leadership, and And sometimes the kids get a little frustrated because I'm always talking about poor leadership. And with my friends, I'm constantly talking about poor leadership. My question would essentially be, and I'm asking myself, and as I think about it, how does this compare to domestic violence and poor leadership at the same time? I truly believe that poor leaders not getting their needs met in the workplace, they become a dictator and everything has to go through them. They become the filter of it. And that's the same way. So that's in the workplace. Now, how does it translate in the home life? So if there's a poor leader in the home, everything has to go through them. The schedules have to go through them. Curfews have to go through them. The money has to go through them. All of these things have to go through this style of leadership. They become the filter of everything, and they are in power of everything around them, and they're in control of things. But ultimately, it's meeting that need of being certain, and then simultaneously they're feeling significant because people are going through them, that they're the point of contact versus the last point of contact. So it makes them feel significant, and it feels that certainty need.
You said that they're in power, and it's interesting because when a dictator leader is in power from the perspective of a dictator leader, the people are not empowered, right? And you were talking about that, and it brought up for me, my dad. Over the summer, I was working with my dad, and he very much is a dictator leader. And that's part of the reason why we don't work together anymore, because I just cannot function under that style of leadership. But he very much so wanted me to create things. But then when I would try to create, he would step in with this position of power, and it literally zapped that creativity. So that's a work example, but very much so this plays into the home. And I can see, one particular spouse having all of that control, and the children not having a voice, being disempowered, and the other spouse not having a voice. And so it sometimes can become more than just not having a say so, but also really, really violent. And that's really what we're here to talk about is, I don't know that in our culture we ask enough questions. Even on Facebook, right? We're constantly commenting. We have a comment. We have a statement to make. A couple months ago, I did a challenge where we had to ask questions of each other all month in our private Facebook group. And the purpose for that is because we're always making comments, but we don't ask enough questions. So I want to continue asking questions here to dive deeper and just really think about this issue of unhealthy relationships, this issue and epidemic of domestic violence in our culture, in our country, in our world. We definitely need to ask questions on how we can end this. And sometimes we can't do the same thing expecting a different result. We have to switch it up. We have to create a shift, right? The leadership. This is a leadership show. So
Nice pun.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. And I did take some time to think about this beforehand. And I think that this will lead us to the place in which we're trying to go. So I want you to pretend, David, just for a minute here, that Earth was no longer habitable, and we found another planet somewhere in our universe that we could all go to and live, right? So God has assigned you to lead this planet. And the one thing that you want to do is create a world with healthy relationships. You want to create a world where domestic violence no longer exists. So what would you do to create that world?
The first thing would be prevention. It would be prevention. And you may be saying, how do we prevent domestic violence? I truly believe when we teach and reward healthy habits, we correct immediately with love and truth. And then we, most importantly, exemplify healthy relationships as leaders.
So I hear you talking about habits, and there's lots of leadership habits out there. I'm curious if there was these habits that we were going to be teaching our littles, right? Which this is ironic too, because I'm sitting here thinking about how you go into schools right now and teach leadership habits to kids. But if we were going to teach habits, what are those habits going to be so that we can prevent it?
First, I believe there's 6 habits to being a great leader. And this is just my definition of it. Number one, first and foremost, it has to be love. Love has to be the foundation of all great leadership because it is absolutely fundamental to human development. It was what we were created from. It was what we were created for. And then it was what we were created with. We were created for love, with love, and by love. So when we come from that place, love is gentle, love is kind, love is not doesn't rejoice in evil. It remembers all truth and it celebrates truth. When we come from that place, we look at people through the lens of love. And when we look at the lens of love, then we are open versus closed off. We are receptive versus closed-minded. So love is the foundational to being a great leader. And I talked about it in my TEDx. Number 2 would essentially be vulnerability. Vulnerability is so important. When I connect with people networking, I tell them that and I encourage them to be vulnerable because vulnerability allows us to create the bridges from one relationship to another. There's nothing worse in the world when you show up to somebody's house and they're blocking something and you're just like, what are you hiding? And they're just like, oh, nothing. But you clearly see that they're hiding something.
You mean like when you're in a conversation with someone and you feel like you're up against a wall?
No, like when you go to somebody's house and you knock on the door and then they open the door and then they're blocking something and you're just like, what are you blocking? And it's just like, nothing. And you clearly see the object behind them and they're telling you nothing. And you just like, you feel that feeling of distrust. And if certainty is a need for a lot of us, creating that vulnerability removes that veil of deception. It removes that veil of the wall that things are perfect. So vulnerability creates it
creates trust, I think. And that would be like a pillar if we were talking about pillars. Yeah, I would say that vulnerability creates trust in that relationship and authenticity. And that's a pillar for leadership overall, really, in relationships overall.
And leadership is relationships. And number 3 would be courage. Courage doesn't mean that we're not afraid. It means that we're taking action despite our fear. So we're moving forward progressively despite the opposition ahead of us. And number 4 would be curious. Like you talked about earlier, you said, on Facebook, people are commenting, people are making statements.
That's what it was. It was the curiosity challenge.
So when we are curious versus commenting, now we're asking questions. Now we have a discovery mindset of how does this work? Why does this work? When does this work?
Why is it not working?
Why is it not working? And when we're curious, that means we're more receptive to receiving what's to come versus certain of already assuming what's to come. So practice curiosity allows us to be more open by simply asking questions about others. There's a great book. I love it. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And Dale Carnegie talks about curious people or interested people are interesting. So we have to be interesting. And in order to be interesting, we have to be curious.
But how does that correlate to healthy relationships?
So in order to be curious and how it correlates to healthy relationships, we have to have those conversations about where did your background come from? Or how was your upbringing? And what did you experience? What are your thoughts on this?
And have you healed?
From
those things, right? Yeah. Because if we haven't healed from those things, they're going to play themselves out in our relationship. And I think being curious too, even knowing, first of all, that we have these 6 human needs and understanding what our partner's needs are. So I think that's really imperative. And I can tell you right now, I already know that you know my greatest need. But I would believe that yours would be, let me see if I can guess. I think it would be certainty.
Certainty is my greatest need.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainty and growth. So curiosity simply leads us to the place of self-discovery. And when we discover who we are and who we belong to, it's a beautiful thing. Number 5, essentially, of those six habits would be communication. Got tongue-tied. So communication, I truly believe it's the vehicle that creates the bridges between the people, and how we communicate with people either create bridges or creates islands. And healthy communication creates bridges. Unhealthy communication creates islands and separation with people.
So if a couple is having a disagreement, then I mean, it's so easy to become emotionally charged when you're in the middle of a disagreement, but I think it would be about creating those habits so that people know how to effectively communicate. I think it's the greatest skill that we need in our life and in our world, and nobody teaches this to us. We learn how to speak, and we learn how to read, and we learn how to write, but no one teaches us how to communicate unless we go and learn that on our own. That's how we learn about it. So we would definitely need to teach communication in this new world.
I respectfully disagree. I think we do learn how to communicate, but we learn how to communicate for our needs versus communicating to connect.
That's true.
Which leads me to number 6 of the 6 habits to being a great leader is conflict resolution. The ability to communicate through conflict is imperative, because oftentimes the word conflict, most people see that as a negative connotation because it has negative connotations around it. But conflict, I was talking to a friend and I told her that conflict is like a doctor's visit. And when we get checked up on, it was just like, okay, I have this symptom. Here's a prescription for it. If the doctor tell you, hey, my man, you're a little overweight, chill with the chips, my man. What are you going to do? You're going to chill with the chips. You don't want a high cholesterol or high blood pressure. So conflict becomes the check-in in relationships. Like, hey, this works. This doesn't work. Continue doing this. This doesn't. Please stop doing this. So finding that resolution.
So conflict is the check-in in relationships. That's good. I never heard you talk about it that way. And I definitely have to say, in our relationship, you've helped me break down those walls of kind of rejecting conflict and avoiding conflict, really, because I always perceive conflict as bad. But teaching the littles, right, in this new world, how to resolve conflict, and teaching them in the first place that conflict is good. Conflict is not bad.
Conflict is good. So those would be the 6 habits to being a great leader.
For sure. So what else would you do?
Most importantly is create a new standard. Social accountability. Oftentimes we look to our government to enforce all of these things that we desire. It's like, wait till the government does this, wait till the government. But the government is an embodiment of the people that is in it. It's not a robots. It's the people that are in government who are creating these changes. They're enforcing these laws. So we as the people have to have that social accountability within one another in our communities. I remember when smoking was acceptable in restaurants, on airplanes, just in general, then we as a people decided no more. We as a people said enough is enough. We as a people said this is not healthy. So we as a people decided it was unacceptable. So when we decide that unhealthy relationships are unacceptable, then we'll start moving in a new wave. Then we'll start creating the change because we as a people have decided that. And I truly believe this with all of my heart. When we are against something, we shouldn't magnify what it is. So there's a lot of protests that's going on right now and saying, end domestic violence, end domestic violence, end domestic violence. And I'm in support of ending domestic violence. My upbringing was domestic violence, but I don't think that's the healthiest way and the most effective way to bringing about change. I truly believe in order for us to bring about change, we have to talk about the things that we want.
Yeah, don't talk about what you don't want. Talk about what we do want. You know what? And that's a great point. But I also want to go back to what you said about how smoking became unacceptable. And the reason why smoking became unacceptable is because so many public service announcements started coming out, right? I remember being a kid and watching some stuff on MTV. Unfortunately, I was already smoking by then. I don't smoke anymore, but I did for a long time. And so I remember what it was like when it was socially acceptable. And then all these PSAs started coming out and information started coming out about how secondhand smoke was worse than firsthand. So with that being said, society decided this is affecting me. And I'm no longer going to put up with this affecting me and my family. So I think our culture has to come to a realization that domestic violence is affecting them. Whether we see it right now or not, it is absolutely affecting. When my situation happened and my ex-husband literally set me on fire, it did not just affect me. It affected Malachi and Malik.
Mm-hmm.
It affected my friends. It affected my family. It affected the neighborhood. It affected the woman who helped save my life, the police that were there, the media. It affected the entire community, right? And so oftentimes we think about how we haven't experienced this, but the reality is that what if it was your daughter? And my question is always this too. What if it was your daughter that was in a violent relationship? Would you care about it then? And what if it was your son who was potentially going to go to prison? Because my ex-husband is somebody's son, and it affected her. It affected his family too. So yeah, social accountability, I think, is a big deal. And that's where we have the most power. I think we all think government is really powerful, and it is in its ways, but social accountability is extremely powerful.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
So I think that I'd like to chime in if you don't mind too. Thirdly, I would say intervention would be a big deal in this new world.
Mm-hmm.
We know that hurt people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that alludes to is the fact that people need healing. And I think that we often address only one side of domestic violence. The person who is hurting, one, will oftentimes go to prison, right? If they're held accountable. But the person who's being hurt is often offered lots of support. Hopefully, they're offered lots of support in order to recover and to heal and to restore. So I think there's two sides of this. We would need to look at it when we're talking about intervention. The first is looking at the perpetrator. And I really believe that, number one, that perpetrator needs to be held accountable, whatever that looks like in our new world, whether that's a prison or, I mean, who knows? Maybe it would be a retreat center and not a prison. Because the second thing I think that they need is they need to be offered rehabilitation and they need to be offered healing. And I say that because it's one thing to support the person who has experienced this, and it is highly necessary. But here's the thing. Let's just say that person who hurt the other one was sentenced to 10 years and they never receive any healing or any rehabilitation. And they come out of prison, and then guess what? Within 6 months, they've got a new girlfriend, and they're doing the same thing all over again. Mm-hmm. So we have to address that side. And not in every case, but in a lot of cases, the person who is doing the harming is the person who's coming from a place of hurt. Mm-hmm. They've experienced trauma. Maybe they grew up around violence. Maybe they had a drug addict of a mother. You never know what people are coming from. But we have to address those wounds. And secondly, the person who's being harmed. In intervention, we definitely need to offer shelter and escape. We need to offer those financial resources for that person to get back on their feet, get them into hiding if we need to through the address confidentiality program, but also just offer them a community where they can come together and understand that, number one, they are not alone. Knowing that we're not alone has a profound effect on the healing process and the healing journey. So I think that community of support is critical, and then offering them some type of healing program for them to go through as well. Just giving them whatever they need in order to thrive. So, yeah.
That was pretty good. Just to summarize what we essentially talked about of creating this new world where domestic violence will no longer be an epidemic will be, number one, prevention. And we talked about the 6 habits of what makes a great leader. The foundational is love being one of them, being curious, and creating, healthy communication and healthy conflict resolution. Then we talked about creating a new standard of social accountability and saying no more, just like we said no more surrounding the smoking epidemic. And then intervention for those who were the perpetrators who committed the crime, offering them an opportunity to heal and be held responsible for what they did. And then those who were harmed, creating a healing program. So I just want to say thank you so much, Audrey, for coming on this episode one more time. I definitely appreciate you. I appreciate the fact that you're speaking about a topic that isn't talked about enough from a different perspective.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes we look at it, this is what's happened to me, versus here's a solution. Yeah. So we talked about it, and I want to thank you for that.
You're
and
welcome.
For those Thank you. And for those who are listening, joining us every second and fourth Wednesday of each month for a new episode. We're on podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. I want you to leave us a review so this podcast can actually reach more leaders to have more difficult conversation, but most importantly, lead people to an empowered life. Next month, we're actually launching our leadership series on Lead Like Jesus. You do not want to miss this because this revolutionized the way we should lead, and it flips the corporate world on its head.
Yeah.
And I also want you to remember this. Remember, if we as leaders are to set ourselves apart, we must start by leading through love, which always comes from the heart.
Thank you for joining us here at the Leader Shift Show. If you'd like access to additional resources and insight, text Leader Shift to 345-345 or visit theleadershiftshow.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please let us know and spread the word by giving us a review on iTunes. You can listen to our show on iTunes, Success Radio, Spotify, Google Play, and the IB Network on Spreaker.com. If you have a question for David, send it our way at prosper@shepherdrevolution.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time here on the Leader Shift Show.